Have you ever wondered what happens when sleep becomes something else entirely? When the boundary between dreams and reality dissolves so completely that you can't tell where one ends and the other begins? Tonight, I'm going to tell you about an experiment that nobody talks about anymore. A study that was buried so deep in classified files that most people don't even know it existed. My name is Alex, and I've spent the last 3 years digging through declassified documents, following paper trails that lead to dead ends, and chasing whispers from former government employees who refuse to go on record. What I found kept me awake for weeks, but tonight I want to share this story with you in the way it was meant to be told, quietly, carefully, like a secret being passed from one person to another in the darkness. So get comfortable. Pull your blankets up close. Let your eyelids grow heavy as I take you back to 1953, to a nondescript building in upstate New York where something unprecedented was about to unfold. The official name was Project Morpheus, but the handful of researchers who worked on it simply called it the sleep experiment. And what they discovered changed everything we thought we knew about consciousness, dreams, and the human mind's capacity to exist in states we never imagined possible. Dr. Eleanor Vasquez was 34 years old when she was recruited for the project. A brilliant neurologist with a specialty in sleep disorders, she'd been handpicked from Johns Hopkins for her groundbreaking work on REM cycles. What she didn't know was that her research had caught the attention of people who operated in the shadows of the Cold War era, people who saw potential applications far beyond treating insomnia. The facility looked ordinary enough from the outside, a converted mansion surrounded by tall pine trees, with grounds that stretched for miles in every direction. But beneath the main building, accessible only through a hidden elevator behind a false wall in the library, lay something extraordinary. A series of chambers designed specifically for extended sleep observation. Each chamber was soundproofed, temperature-controlled, and equipped with monitoring equipment that was decades ahead of anything available in civilian hospitals. The beds were unlike anything you'd find in a regular sleep lab. They were designed to sustain a human body for extended periods, with built-in waste management systems and intravenous feeding capabilities. The recruitment process for test subjects was shrouded in secrecy. Advertisements appeared in small-town newspapers across the Midwest, offering generous compensation for participation in a sleep study that would contribute to advancing medical science. The requirements were specific. Participants had to be between the ages of 25 and 40, with no history of mental illness, no family dependencies, and most importantly, no one who would be immediately missed if they disappeared for several months. 12 people were selected. Their names have been redacted from every document I've found, but I've been able to piece together some details about who they were. There was a drifter from Kansas who'd been traveling from town to town doing odd jobs, a former soldier who'd returned from Korea with nowhere to go, a woman who'd recently lost her husband and child in a car accident and seemed to welcome the idea of sleeping through her grief. Dr. Vasquez later described the initial interviews in her personal notes, which surfaced briefly in the 1970s before being classified again. She wrote about how each participant seemed to be running from something, seeking escape through sleep in a way that made them perfect candidates for what was about to unfold. The experiment began on a Tuesday in October. The participants were given physical examinations, psychological evaluations, and what they were told was a mild sedative to help them relax. What they weren't told was that the sedative contained a cocktail of experimental compounds designed to alter their sleep patterns in ways that had never been attempted before. Dr. Vasquez's team had developed a theory that consciousness existed on a spectrum, and that sleep was merely one point on that spectrum. They believed that with the right combination of drugs, environmental controls, and psychological conditioning, they could guide subjects into deeper states of consciousness than had ever been achieved in a laboratory setting. The first phase of the experiment seemed routine. Participants slept normally for the first 72 hours. Their brain waves monitored continuously. Their vital signs recorded every 15 minutes. But on the fourth day, something began to change. The EEG readings showed patterns that Dr. Vasquez had never seen before. The participants' brain waves weren't following normal sleep cycles. Instead, they seemed to be locked in a state that existed somewhere between deep sleep and something else entirely. Something that didn't have a name in any medical textbook. More intriguingly, the participants began to display signs of awareness while remaining completely unconscious. They would respond to questions posed by researchers, but their responses came in the form of subtle muscle contractions, changes in breathing patterns, and fluctuations in heart rate that had to be interpreted through careful observation and measurement. By the end of the first week, it became clear that something unprecedented was happening. The participants weren't just sleeping deeply. They were existing in a state of consciousness that seemed to transcend normal waking awareness. Their responses to stimuli suggested they were experiencing something far more complex than dreams. Dr. Vasquez began conducting what she called consciousness interviews. She would sit beside each sleeping participant and ask questions about their experience, about what they were seeing, feeling, and understanding in their altered state. The responses, when they came, were unlike anything she'd encountered in her career. The participants described experiences that seemed to exist outside normal space and time. They spoke of traveling through landscapes that were simultaneously familiar and impossible. They described conversations with people who couldn't possibly be there, encounters with versions of themselves from different points in their lives, and most disturbingly, awareness of the other participants' experiences, as if they were all connected in some vast, shared consciousness. One participant, whose responses Dr. Vasquez recorded in detail, described watching his own childhood from the perspective of his adult self, but with the understanding that both versions of himself were equally real and present. Another spoke of having conversations with her deceased mother, conversations that felt more real and meaningful than any interaction she'd had while awake. The most unsettling discovery came during the second week. The participants began to demonstrate knowledge they couldn't possibly possess. They would provide detailed information about the facility, about the researchers' personal lives, about events happening in the outside world that they had no way of knowing about while unconscious. Dr. Vasquez documented case after case of participants displaying what could only be described as extrasensory perception. They knew when researchers were approaching their chambers before the door opened. They could accurately describe the contents of sealed envelopes placed in adjacent rooms. Most remarkably, they seemed to be aware of each other's experiences in real time, as if their consciousness had somehow merged into a collective awareness. The audio recordings from this period paint a picture of a research team that was simultaneously fascinated and terrified by what they were witnessing. Dr. Vasquez's voice, initially clinical and detached, gradually becomes more strained as the implications of their discovery become clear. By the third week, the participants' physical condition began to deteriorate, but their consciousness seemed to be expanding exponentially. Their bodies were maintained by the life support systems, but their minds appeared to be operating on a level that defied conventional understanding of human consciousness. the researchers realized they were witnessing something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the nature of reality itself. The participants weren't just sleeping. They had entered a state of existence that seemed to transcend the normal boundaries of individual consciousness. But what happened next would change everything. And the recordings from those final days would reveal something so profound, so unsettling, that the entire project would be shut down and buried so deep that it would take decades for even fragments of the truth to surface. The participants never woke up, but they never stopped being aware, and what they discovered in that space between sleep and waking would shake the foundations of everything we thought we knew about consciousness, reality, and the true nature of human existence. As we moved into the fourth week, Dr. Vasquez's recordings take on an increasingly urgent tone. You can hear it in her voice, the way she stumbles over words that should come easily to someone with her expertise. She's documenting something that shouldn't exist, and the weight of that realization is crushing. The participants had been unconscious for 25 days, but their brain activity was unlike anything in medical literature. The EEG machines were picking up synchronized patterns across all 12 subjects, as if their minds were operating as a single unit. Dr. Vasquez described it as watching 12 instruments playing the same complex symphony, each contributing to a harmony that was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. What made everything worse was that the participants seemed to know things they had no business knowing. During one particularly unsettling session, Subject 7 began describing in perfect detail the layout of Dr. Vasquez's childhood home, including the location of a music box she'd hidden under loose floorboards when she was 9 years old. A music box that no living person knew about except her. The government officials who'd been monitoring the project from a distance suddenly became very interested in these developments. Men in dark suits began appearing at the facility, asking questions about practical applications, about whether this state of consciousness could be weaponized or used for intelligence gathering. Dr. Vasquez's notes from this period are filled with references to the visitors and their increasingly aggressive demands for results. But the participants weren't just displaying psychic abilities. They were changing in ways that defied explanation. Their bodies remained in a state of suspended animation, but somehow they were aging differently. Their hair continued to grow, their nails lengthened, but their skin took on an almost translucent quality. Under certain lighting conditions, you could see the network of veins beneath their skin pulsing with a rhythm that didn't match their heartbeat. Dr. Vasquez became obsessed with understanding what was happening to them. She would spend 18-hour days in the facility, monitoring their vital signs, conducting her consciousness interviews, and documenting every anomaly. Her assistant, Dr. James Chan, later described her as someone who was slowly losing her grip on reality, becoming as trapped in the experiment as the subjects themselves. The breakthrough came during the 5th week, though breakthrough might not be the right word for what happened. Subject 3, a woman who'd lost her family in that car accident, began to speak. Not the subtle muscle contractions or breathing changes they'd been interpreting as communication, but actual words, clear, articulate sentences that emerged from her lips while her eyes remained closed, and her body showed no other signs of consciousness. Her first words were simple: "We can see you watching us." But what followed was a detailed description of the observation room, including the location of recording equipment, the contents of Dr. Vasquez's coffee cup, and the exact time displayed on the wall clock. She was describing their current reality from a perspective that should have been impossible. The other participants began speaking soon after, but never individually. They would finish each other's sentences, respond to questions that hadn't been asked aloud, and carry on conversations with people who weren't in the room. It was as if they were all accessing the same source of information, the same expanded awareness that existed beyond the boundaries of the facility. Dr. Vasquez's recordings from this period are difficult to listen to. Her voice shakes as she describes conversations with subjects who seem to know intimate details about her life, her fears, her deepest regrets. They would offer comfort for losses she'd never spoken about, answer questions she'd only thought to herself, and provide insights into problems she was struggling with in her personal life. But the most disturbing aspect was how they began to predict future events. Small things at first. They would mention that Dr. Chen would spill coffee on his shirt before lunch, and he would. They would describe the contents of phone calls before the phone rang. They would warn about minor equipment failures, minutes before they occurred. The predictions grew more significant as the experiment continued. Subject 9 accurately described a car accident that would occur 3 miles from the facility 2 days before it happened. Subject 12 provided detailed information about a break-in at Dr. Vasquez's apartment that wouldn't occur for another week. They seemed to exist in a state where past, present, and future were equally accessible. The government officials became increasingly interested in these predictive abilities. They began bringing in specialists from other departments, people whose credentials were never fully disclosed. Dr. Vasquez's notes describe heated arguments with these officials about the ethics of the experiment, about the welfare of the participants, and about the implications of what they were discovering. But the participants themselves seemed unconcerned about their physical condition. When Dr. Vasquez expressed worry about their deteriorating bodies, they would respond with something approaching amusement. "These shells are temporary," Subject 7 once said through barely moving lips. "What we are now is so much more." They described their experience as existing in a space between spaces, a realm where consciousness could expand beyond the limitations of individual minds. They spoke of traveling through memories that weren't their own, of experiencing every emotion that had ever been felt, of understanding connections between all living things that were invisible to normal perception. The recordings from the 6th week reveal a research team that was beginning to fracture under the pressure of what they were witnessing. Dr. Chen had developed severe insomnia and was showing signs of psychological distress. Other team members were requesting transfers or simply abandoning the project without explanation. Dr. Vasquez herself was the only one who seemed unable to step away from what was happening. The participants' predictions were becoming increasingly accurate and increasingly disturbing. They began describing events that wouldn't occur for months, providing specific dates, times, and locations with perfect precision. They spoke of political changes, natural disasters, and personal tragedies with the same detached clarity they used to describe the weather. But perhaps most unsettling was when they began to describe their own fate. They spoke of the moment when the experiment would end, when the equipment would be shut down, when their bodies would finally fail. They described it not with fear or sadness, but with a kind of serene acceptance that suggested they had moved beyond normal human concerns about death and survival. "You think you're watching us die," Subject 4 said during one of the final recorded sessions. "But we're watching you live such small lives, trapped in bodies that can only experience one moment at a time. We've become something you can't understand, something that exists in all moments simultaneously." The end came suddenly and without warning. On the 43rd day of the experiment, all 12 participants stopped breathing within minutes of each other, not gradually, not due to equipment failure, but as if they had collectively decided to let go of their physical forms at the same moment. Dr. Vasquez's final recording is barely audible, her voice reduced to a whisper as she describes the moment of their passing. But what makes the recording truly disturbing is what happened next. In the silence that followed their deaths, she began to hear something that shouldn't have been possible. The participants were still there, not their voices, not their breathing, but something else entirely. A presence that filled the observation room like a frequency just beyond the range of human hearing. Dr. Vasquez described it as feeling watched by something vast and patient, something that had transcended the need for physical form, but hadn't abandoned its connection to our reality. The equipment registered nothing. Heart monitors showed flat lines. Brain activity had ceased. But Dr. Vasquez swore she could feel them there, observing her with the same clinical detachment she had once used to observe them. In her final notes, she wrote about conversations that took place without words, about understanding that flooded her mind without explanation. She described feeling pulled toward the same state the participants had achieved, as if their expanded consciousness was beckoning her to join them in that space between sleep and waking. The temptation was overwhelming after weeks of witnessing their transcendence. The limitations of normal human awareness felt suffocating, but the government officials had seen enough. Within hours of the participants' deaths, the facility was swarming with personnel whose job was to make Project Morpheus disappear. Equipment was dismantled, records were confiscated, and the surviving research team was scattered to different departments with strict confidentiality agreements. Dr. Vasquez fought to preserve her research, arguing that they had discovered something fundamental about the nature of consciousness itself. But her pleas fell on deaf ears. The practical applications that had initially interested the government had proven too unpredictable, too dangerous to pursue. The participants' ability to see the future was useless if they couldn't be controlled or directed. The audio recordings were supposed to be destroyed, but Dr. Vasquez managed to hide copies in various locations, hoping that someday the truth would surface. Most of those recordings have never been found, but the few that survived paint a picture of a discovery so profound that it challenged everything we thought we knew about human potential. Dr. Vasquez disappeared 6 months after the project ended. Her apartment was found empty, with no signs of struggle or forced entry. Her car was discovered parked at a remote lake in upstate New York, but her body was never found. The official report listed her as a missing person, but those who knew about Project Morpheus suspected something else entirely. Some say she found a way to achieve the same state as her subjects, that she learned to exist in that space between consciousness and something greater. Others believe she was silenced by the same forces that buried the experiment. But there are those who claim to have encountered her in dreams, in that twilight space between sleeping and waking, still guiding others toward the truth she discovered. The participants' bodies were cremated immediately, their ashes scattered in unmarked locations. Their families, what few they had, were told they had died in a car accident. The facility was demolished within a year, the land sold to a developer who built a shopping center on the site. But the story doesn't end there, because what Dr. Vasquez and her team discovered wasn't just about sleep or consciousness. It was about the nature of reality itself, about the possibility that what we think of as individual existence is just one way of experiencing something much larger and more connected than we ever imagined. The 12 participants of Project Morpheus found a way to transcend the boundaries of normal human consciousness. They discovered that sleep, when pushed to its absolute limits, could become a doorway to something extraordinary. And in that space between dreaming and waking, they found a truth that was too dangerous for the world to know. So tonight, As you drift off to sleep, remember that the boundary between conscious and unconscious isn't as solid as we pretend it is. In that moment, just before you fully surrender to sleep, when your mind begins to let go of the day's concerns and your consciousness starts to expand beyond the confines of your physical form, you might catch a glimpse of what those 12 brave souls discovered in that hidden facility so many years ago. Sleep well, knowing that somewhere in the space between dreams and reality, the participants of Project Morpheus continue their eternal experiment, exploring realms of consciousness that the rest of us can only imagine. And perhaps, if you listen carefully in the quiet moments before dawn, you might hear their whispered voices sharing the secrets they learned in that place where sleep becomes something else entirely. The truth is out there, waiting in the darkness behind your closed eyelids. All you have to do is let go and allow yourself to fall deeper than you've ever fallen before. Sweet dreams.